for more on the Trump transition, we have our NBC News team here on set. Garrett Haake has the latest from inside Trump world, and Julia Ainsley has the latest on Trump staffing up on the crackdown at the border. So thank you both for being here. I feel like we're going to see this a lot in the next 4 years. You two sitting side by side, breaking stuff down. So Garrett, I want to come to you. We are now seeing some major positions in the administration be picked here. I wonder what you make of the order of this and what it means, what the significance of it is that we're seeing these positions be announced in this order.
Well, I think the order of it matters less than the positions, because in many cases the positions have not actually been announced. Marco Rubio, for example, has not actually been formally confirmed by anybody. Some of this is just the pace that reporters are able to break news out of Mar-a-Lago, which is leaking like a sieve at the moment. But I think the selections themselves do matter. I think that whooshing sound you heard last night was the foreign policy establishment in this town breathing a huge sigh of relief at the news that Marco Rubio would be chosen. I think there was a lot of concern in Washington that we would see someone more committed to the America First ideology, sort of pulling back from the world stage. Whatever else you think of Marco Rubio, that's not him. I think he's much more in line with traditional Republican thinking, even as he has come around to backing Trump on some of his more controversial foreign policy decisions. So I think you're seeing a robust anti-China, pro-Israel, NATO skeptical but not antagonistic foreign policy team taking shape around Donald Trump, and I suspect we'll see more of the same in the coming days.
And Julia, I want to ask you, as we talk about these picks, Kristi Noem, of course, is seen as the pick for DHS Secretary. You, of course, are our Homeland Security correspondent here. What are your biggest takeaways when you think of her?
I mean, I was surprised. Honestly, I try to stay up on my beat, figure out who might be a top contender here. This name was not on my bingo card, and I don't think it was for a lot of people. Most people thought Chad Wolf, the last acting DHS Homeland Security Secretary under Trump, would be back. He's been someone who's been very close to Stephen Miller for 4 years, working with him at the America's First Policy Institute, which you know is really ingrained with this incoming administration. But Noem is someone who was once seen as a possible VP pick. I'm also told that Trump really likes to be adding more women to cabinet positions. And again, it gets back to that common denominator you talked about, Yamiche, fierce loyalty. And I'm also told that Trump does like to throw some surprises, show everybody nobody can predict him. This is his show at the end, and that, you know, he is going to pick people based on who he wants. Now, does she have Homeland Security experience? Not that I can tell. I mean, she was a governor of a state that's not a border state. She did weigh in on immigration issues, offered to send National Guard and razor wire down to Texas. But when she served in Congress, she was on the Ways and Means Committee. I mean, there's not really a clear path to Homeland Security here. And she'll have a huge portfolio. I think one thing someone pointed out to me today, in addition to Tom Homan, who we can talk about some more, is that the deputy at DHS will do the day-to-day running and staffing. So let's pay attention to how the rest of this agency comes together, because this is a huge federal workforce, and it's really been a behemoth for anyone to manage.
And Garrett, I want to bring you in on the Kristi Noem's not having significant experience, as Julia points out. How does her profile fit among the other people that we've seen named now?
I was surprised by this announcement, as were many of my sources in Trump world, if that tells you anything. It was reported late overnight this morning. A lot of people were waking up to the news in close to Trump, surprised by this announcement. I think it's possible that given Tom Homan being named as the czar, the centrality of immigration to the Trump White House, that portfolio will largely exist within the White House. And it's possible, and I'm speculating here a little bit, that Noem is someone who I think is being rewarded for loyalty and for her perceived ability to go out and sell the administration's agenda. I think I can imagine her being someone who Trump thinks would do a good job on television, testifying in front of the House or the Senate, kind of selling those priorities perhaps more than running it on a day-to-day basis. That being said, as a sitting governor, she has some touch points with some of the other things that come under DHS, like FEMA for disaster aid and some of the non-border elements of what is a massive agency. So we'll see how the rest of that department gets fleshed out. And I'll just add, this is one that has not been announced by Trump. It has been reported. So we'll see if it sticks.
Yeah. Well, talking about the sort of border as being a big part of this, you bring up, of course, Tom Homan, who has been named or is expected to be named the border czar. So tell us about that pick, Julia. And I wonder if you could talk about how that sort of dovetails and connects with Trump's overall stated goal of making the immigration and mass deportation deportations his top priority.
Yes, and Homan seems to be sticking more than Noam, at least at the moment, because that is something that Trump put out himself. Noam, we understand, did get a call from Trump, but he hasn't announced it yet publicly. Now, what this means is it's a very centralized White House. We've even seen since the 60s, as the federal government has expanded, there have been kind of little pieces of the executive branch of these agencies put inside. Think of NSC being like the State Department. With the border czar, it's bringing DHS and immigration policy inside the White House, and Tom Homan is going to have a power, honestly, like someone maybe we haven't seen before when it comes to these deportations, because he's going to be able to talk to the State Department and say, put pressure on countries that are not taking back their nationals, so we can deport more people to places like Venezuela or Nicaragua or China. He could put pressure on them that way. He could get the Labor Department to do more workplace raids. He could get Health and Human Services to do things that would crack down on the number of unaccompanied children who are coming around. Yeah. There's a lot of power he will have, and he'll be talking to Trump every day in the White House.
Yeah, well, talking of power and sort of who's talking to Trump, who does have President-elect Trump's ear in this moment? I've heard a lot, and we've all seen pictures of Elon Musk down at Mar-a-Lago, but who else is sort of there?
Well, look, his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, is still probably the most key advisor on the payroll. I mean, he's someone whose decisions are probably not made in a vacuum. Elon Musk, I think you cannot overstate his influence right now. Our sourcing has been that he's basically not left Mar-a-Lago since Election Day. He's a fairly constant presence there. I think J.D. Vance's influence is being felt, as is the cadre of advisors around him who are kind of newer converts to Trumpism, who might be whispering in his ear. We'll see if they're able to make more of an imprint on his choices going forward.
Well, it's going to be a question we're going to be asking a lot over the next 4 years. Who's talking to Trump and influencing him? So thank you so much to Garrett, to Julia. Well, like I said, we'll be back here, I'm sure,
soon. We look forward to it.
Thanks. And as President-elect Donald Trump readies his cabinet, congressional Republicans are preparing for his arrival. Mr. Trump will be here in Washington tomorrow to meet with President Biden, House Speaker Mike Johnson, and the incoming Senate Republican leader, who will be chosen literally just moments before their meeting. Senators John Cornyn, Rick Scott, and John Thune are all vying for that majority leader role. And this morning, we caught up with Florida Senator Rick Scott as he made his pitch to fellow Republicans.
I think I'm uniquely positioned to really help get the Trump agenda done. Number one, I believe in it. Number two, I've got a great working relationship with him and with Mike Johnson and all the leadership in the House. I'm optimistic I'm going to win. I'm talking about the things that people say they care about, and so we'll see.
There is also a lot of action in the U.S. House. While NBC News has not yet called control of the chamber, Republicans appear poised to retain control. But their margins will once again be razor thin. And the president-elect's choice of House Republicans Elise Stefanik and Mike Waltz to serve in his administration will temporarily shrink those margins even more. Today, both Speaker Mike Johnson and Majority Leader Steve Scalise issued something of a warning to President-elect Trump.
You can see his resolve already and how quickly he's making really good, smart picks. I know he's already pulled a few really talented people out of the House, hopefully no more for a little while until special elections can come.
President Trump fully understands and appreciates the math here, and it's just a numbers game. We believe we're going to have a larger majority than we had last time. It's too early to handicap it, but we're optimistic about that. But every single vote will count. I don't expect that we will have more members leaving, but I'll leave that up to him.
And joining me now from Capitol Hill is NBC's Ryan Noble. So, Ryan, thanks for being here. We saw Speaker Johnson struggled with slim majorities this Congress all year. How is he preparing for that possibility again?
Well, he's having conversations already, Amish. I think he's going to a lot of the members that gave him somewhat of a hard time during the first year of his speakership and talking to them about what he can do to make the process easier. And I think he also believes that there's an expectation that with Donald Trump in the White House, that he's going to have a much easier time doing things that conservative Republicans don't like to do, like passing a budget to make sure the government doesn't shut down, raising the debt ceiling, things that often lead to fights among the conservative ranks of his party. That's not to say that there won't be some fights, because there are members of the House Republican caucus that probably want to go even further to the right than what Donald Trump will be willing to do when he is the president. But Mike Johnson is pointing to his record of accomplishment here, the fact that he was able to retain the majority when there were a lot of questions as to whether or not he would be able to do that, and is also showing the tight and close relationship that he has with the president-elect as a reason for conservatives to help support him in this agenda when they actually take control of the gavel again in the new year.
And Ryan, as you're talking about sort of what's going on there, I also want to ask you about Republican control of both chambers, which looks likely now. I'm wondering, are we going to see a sort of unleashed Trump here? Do you think there's going to be any sort of willingness by Republicans if Trump and Republicans have control of basically all of Washington to push back on President-elect Trump?
I think he's certainly going to have an extended honeymoon, Yamiche, that maybe no president has ever seen before because of how decisive his election was, and basically erased any sort of doubt as to whether or not the MAGA wing of the party is in charge of the Republican Party. It definitively is, and that's the reason that they control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. They haven't projected the House, but that seems to be the direction it is going in. So he's going to have an opportunity here to lay out an agenda, and it's going to be very difficult for any member of his party to push back on that agenda. But he's also going to have, along with it, the expectations of delivering on these promises that he made during the campaign, a lot of which didn't have a degree of specificity tied to them. So this is an opportunity, but also a challenge for the new president-elect.
And I also want to ask you, as we continue to talk about President-elect Trump, where do things stand on the race for Senate Majority Leader? And in particular, do we think that Trump is trying to sort of influence who ultimately gets this job?
Yamiche, it's actually been surprising how little Donald Trump is weighing in on the race for Senate Majority Leader. He could decide tomorrow who the next Senate Majority Leader would be. If he came out and endorsed Rick Scott, John Thune, or John Cornyn, any one of those men would probably be on a glide path to the Senate majorityship, even though it is a closed ballot. So the fact that he hasn't weighed in shows that he's leaving it up to these senators to make that decision on their own. All three of them are demonstrating a willingness to enact his agenda and do so as quickly as possible. Even though Rick Scott has said that he's the one who is most aligned with Trump, all three men have a compelling case in that direction.
Well, certainly interesting not to see Donald Trump weighing in on this race, but we'll know the results soon enough. So thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.